Hello everyone, we are Group Pathos of LBY2 Statistics, Block A73, and today we will discuss our research on the effect of gender on the relationship between resource allocation and burnout amongst company employees. Numerous literature have stated that there were gender differences in the level of burnout experienced by people. A research titled Gender Role Perspectives in Job Burnout discovered that female employees reported burnout physically and emotionally significantly more than male employees. Similarly, another research conducted on 103 clinically diagnosed burnout patients showed that females returned higher scores in emotional exhaustion, sleepiness, and tiredness in comparison to males. Data was gathered from 12,250 company employees comprised of 6,445 females and 5,805 males. The group was tasked to answer a questionnaire that reported their gender, whether they were male or female, resource allocation, defined as the amount of resource allocated to the employee to work, for example, the number of hours they should work in a scale of 1 to 10, and the level of burnout they experienced, measured as the participants' mental fatigue in a scale of 0 to 10. Now, let's briefly discuss the model that we tested. The researchers tested whether resource allocation predicts burnout, coded as mental fatigue, and whether gender moderates the effect of resource allocation on mental fatigue among company employees. More specifically, whether resource allocation only predicted mental fatigue in women but not in men.
Now I will be reporting the intercorrelation of the variables. Based on the correlation matrix, gender is weakly correlated with mental fatigue and resource allocation. This indicates that resource allocation and mental fatigue are more correlated with men because the variable was coded as the higher value of 1 as opposed to women who were coded as 0 in the binary distribution. Resource allocation, that is, the number of working hours, strongly correlated with mental fatigue. More work indicated a higher level of mental fatigue for the company employees.
So now let's talk about the reporting of the regression analysis on the dependent variables. The overall model demonstrated a large effect size. On the multivariate level, the model coefficients show that gender predicts mental fatigue. Due to the binary distribution, this indicates that men tend to experience more mental fatigue than women. Likewise, resource allocation also predicted mental fatigue.
Now, I'll report the moderation estimates. A moderation analysis in Table 4 demonstrates that resource allocation and gender also predicts mental fatigue. Most importantly, it was discovered that gender was not a moderator in the effect of resource allocation on mental fatigue. As such, there will be no need for a simple slope analysis.
For the next part, we will see whether the various statistical assumptions were met. To begin, the Shapiro-Wilk test was not conducted due to the very large sample size. Some assumptions for the regression analysis and moderation analysis were violated. First, the moderator and the predictor were correlated as demonstrated in the correlation matrix. Second, the residuals displayed a pattern which violates the homoscedasticity assumption. Nonetheless, there were no multicollinear variables and no multivariate outliers detected. Lastly, we will be going back to our main research questions and come up with some conclusions based on what we have discovered so far and existing literature that might support the results. To reiterate, the study tested whether resource allocation predicts mental fatigue and whether gender moderates the effect of resource allocation on mental fatigue among company employees. More specifically, whether resource allocation only predicted mental fatigue in women but not in men. The study discovered that first, resource allocation does predict mental fatigue in company employees. The more resources allocated to the employee, the higher the mental fatigue was for him or her. The study also discovered that gender does not moderate the effect of resource allocation on mental fatigue. Resource allocation predicts an employee's mental fatigue regardless of the person's gender. According to our research, the most effective way to measure burnout is through the level of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduction in professional efficacy. The results could be explained further by a research conducted by Muros and Pervanova, which states that for women, burnout or mental fatigue is expressed through emotional exhaustion, while for men, it comes in the form of depersonalization or the tendency to have negative feelings or be cynical with regards to their job. As such, in contrast to the popular belief that women mentally fatigue more than men, both genders actually experience similar levels of mental fatigue but express it in different ways. Hence, gender will not moderate the relationship between resource allocation and fatigue because although one gender tends to be more depersonalized or emotionally exhausted, both will still report the same level of mental fatigue as it encompasses both dimensions. However, future researchers can further explore whether gender moderates the effect of resource allocation on depersonalization or emotional exhaustion. In such cases, gender may play an influence in the relationship more than it did for mental fatigue. Once again, we are Group Pathos of LBY2 Statistics Block A73, and we would like to thank you for listening to our presentation.